to this episode, the second in our series on the gateway back to the Holocaust. I'm your host, Craig Winn. What we have been doing is considering what Isaiah revealed in the 17th chapter of his prophetic declaration regarding the future of Israel, where he explicitly said that Damascus would be the epicenter of a terrorist uprising and that the Syrian government would fall. Now, that's actually quite a prediction because Damascus is the longest continuously inhabited city in the world. And as much as it appeared as if the Assad regime would fall when the United States marshaled so many Islamic jihadists against the Assad regime and sent the CIA in to destabilize the Assad regime, it didn't materialize until this past year when an offshoot of the Islamic State, a former group affiliated with Al Qaeda, part of the U.S. Awakening program, perpetrated an Islamic coup. And now Islamic jihadists rule Syria, having disposed the Syrian government exactly as the prophecy foretells. And it is in context with this that the prophecy will continue to talk about how the various jihadists, while also merging with and unifying with, it calls them the outcasts of Aurora, which would be the so-called Palestinian Muslims who are enraged against Israel and ready to perpetrate jihad against Israel in Jordan, and how collectively they are going to marshal their forces and come at Israel in a giant flood. But beyond all of that, we also have now progressives and Muslims in a red-green alliance, a partnership of opposites vying for genocide against Jews, while claiming that they're fighting on behalf of Palestine to protect Palestine from genocide, since there is no Palestine, and the only purpose of the myth of Palestine is to perpetrate genocide against Jews. That is why it was conceived. We can only conclude that this alliance is a baptism in blood, calling for the annihilation of Israel and the Jewish people. And they, of course, are in complete control of the United Nations. Between progressive Europeans and Islamic countries, the United Nations is nothing but a propagandist arm for the progressive Islamic alliance. And there is nothing they would rather do than join in with the European zeal now to boycott Israel and to aid and abet the next Holocaust. And the United States is pushing Russia, China, and Iran together, which is also disastrous for Israel, giving Iran the cover that it needs to complete its nuclear program and to fill in any gaps that might have existed in the developing an arsenal of nuclear bombs and launching them. And this is all a result of America's misadventures by using Ukraine as a proxy against Russia. Put it all together, and having just recently sold $150 billion worth of America's most powerful weapons to the Islamic regimes, the dictatorships that are best noted for calling for the annihilation of Israel, and America's support for Turkey through NATO, even though Erdogan has called for the annihilation of Israel. Now we see that all the pieces are in place for the way this prophecy foretells that the world will devolve into carving a state of Islamic terror out of the heart of Israel, leading to the death of millions of Jews and billions of people worldwide. The world is being crippled by a frenemy and is now ripe for world war. Now, although Syria's demise was inevitable, at least looking at the recent iteration of things, a dozen years of conflict was ignited by America's stunningly stupid invasion of Iraq. And Assad, while he did gain some control temporarily and appeared to have the upper hand, it's the very Sunni jihadists that the U.S. created through the Awakening program in Iraq that evolved into the Islamic State, ISIS. They have returned to their birthplace, only to have metastasized as HTS. And now we have a de facto terrorist government to replace the falling government out of Damascus, just as the prophet foretold. Russia has been playing an important role in all of this. Yes, they appear to have lost an ally, but Muslims are very good at making certain that they don't block any supplier of arms. And clearly, the new Syrian regime is going to find favor in Moscow, just as they have already found favor with Donald Trump and with the entire European Union, all leading to Israel's demise. And while Assad was a ruthless dictator, as were Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi, but is always the case, the Muslims who replaced them are far, far worse. And so, as was the case in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, deposing despots continues to be counterproductive. Moreover, Turkey has neutralized America's only marginally effective weapon, the Kurds. They have been left to face Turkish guns at their backs as Turkey turns its back on all of this in terms of morality, fairness, justice, and yet as a NATO nation is a very dangerous cog in the Islamic war machine, creating a barbaric, ruthless, and abusive environment that is murderous now in Turkey and in Syria, which is largely controlled now by Turkey, although primarily controlled by the Islamic State. Now, these trends, however, all veil a picture obscuring it. The numbers are compelling. The Sunni Muslims outnumber Shiites nearly 3-1 in the Middle East and by more than 4-1 worldwide eventually. And it's just obvious as to who's going to prevail in terms of control. Equally pertinent, Sunnis, which receive the most lethal American weapons, are vastly better armed. The 46 Sunni majority Islamic nations spend almost $200 billion annually on their militaries, while Saudi Arabia is leading the campaign at about $100 billion now a year. The 4 Shiite majority countries, Iran, Iraq, Azerbaijan, and Bahrain, devote less than $15 billion annually to their war preparations with Iran and Iraq, each devoting $6 billion to their military forces each year. Syria is a bit of an anomaly because it is its $2 billion military expenditures were on behalf of Shia Islam, and now are in the hands of Islamic terrorists. Although it is true that the IDF did, as the prophet foretold, and did bomb the outskirts of Damascus to obliterate much of Assad's war machine, keeping it out of the hands of ISIS. I don't think what Israel recognizes, though, is that the wars that they have fought and won at considerable odds were largely fought by armies. The War of Independence was an all Islamic militant military attack, I should say, on Israel. So was the 1966, 67 Six-Day War. So was the 1973 Yom Kippur War. But that is not going to be the case, just as it was not the case of October 7th, which was the most effective war perpetrated against Israel. Muslims aren't very bright, but they got this one right from a very bad point of view, that an all-jihadi attack where the jihadists walk in and ride motor scooters, most of them not even armed with anything other than the savagery of Islam, perpetrated far more carnage on Jews than have all the tanks that have ever roared, or all of the airplanes that have ever soared. So this is what's going to happen next, and therefore wiping out the old Assad military aircraft and tanks is really insignificant in terms of being able to protect Israel. Israel is very much wrong in the perception that its next war is going to be between militaries as opposed to a next onslaught of a flood of jihadists. Well, collectively, the math says that in this proxy war, the Shiites are outmanned 4-1, and they're outgunned 10-1 by the Sunnis, and the math will ultimately catch up with them, as it did the rebels during the American Civil War. Either that, or with Muslims in Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, the PA, Gaza, fighting to obliterate Israel, and the IDF in survival mode. Damascus will be the next Gaza. I realize that since Israel is unwilling to admit that their enemy is Islam, since Muslims outnumber Jews by over 100-1, and since Israel has invited this disease into its midst, and since progressives have become war criminals in their rage against Jews, this is not a war that Israel can win the way it is currently fighting. Not without Yahowah and Dod's intervention. You know, Israel loves to show the pictures of destroyed Gaza as they're winning. But no, with every building they blow up, they lose the war that matters most. That's the one in worldwide public opinion. And the fact of the matter is that they're manufacturing more jihadists than Israel is killing. So it's suicide what Israel is doing, and continuing to do the same thing is not going to produce a different result. In the context of this rebuke of belligerence, we should not lose sight of the fact that the United States outspends Russia and China combined by 3-1 militarily. America squanders $900 billion on its war machine. Just $250 billion is spent annually by Assad's allies in Russia and China. And it's already a sad fact, but where the United States has pulled out of alliances apart from the most fundamentalist Islamic nations of the Middle East, where they have been enhanced in a very negative sort of way with weapons. China has been filling the gap, and so has Russia worldwide, gaining in influence while the Americans shriek in influence, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates, of course, and Turkey, since it's a NATO ally. So this is all evidence that Yahweh's pronouncement through the prophet Yeshayah was accurate. He foresaw what most of the world has missed. All along, America has been the nation consistently preventing Israel from finishing the job. It's been the case all the way through. From the War of Independence, where the United States actually had an embargo against Israel. The 1967 war, where Israel would have owned the Sinai, would have controlled much of Syria and Lebanon and Jordan, and yet it was the United States that forced Israel to give it back to stop the war. And the Yom Kippur War, Israel could have controlled all of the land around it, and yet it was the U.S. that made Israel stop. Now, when Israel was finally under control of Gaza, it was the United States that forced Israel to give Gaza to the jihadi Muslims. Look at the result. And now that Israel's finally able to prevent more weapons from flowing into the Fakistinians, these malcontent Muslims in Gaza, because of their control of the Philadelphian corridor between Egypt and Gaza, it's the United States that is having a conniption fit and telling Israel that they have to end this war. It's always the United States, always the same thing, always thwarting Israel's security, all for a single reason, and that is that America values oil, energy, more than it does morality. America's heart is becoming as dark as the ooze that flows beneath the Islamic sands. All along, America has undermined Israel's survival while giving lip service to being America's best friend. And ultimately, this is going to lead to the obliteration of much of the promised land. America is Israel's Trojan horse. Donald Trump is Israel's Neville Chamberlain. Now, we know this because God's promises are reliable. He made a solemn vow to reconcile his relationship with Yisrael and Yehudah at the conclusion of the time of Israel's troubles, which began on the 22nd of May, 2026, and conclude on the 24th of September, Shabat, in 2033, 7 years thereafter, with Shabuah and then with Towrah, the two remaining harvests. God specifically delineated what is to come in Yeshayah, along with the timeline, and the magnitude was presented through the prophet Yoel, so we would know and we could sound the alarm so that Yisrael was prepared. But the only way that those Yehudim, the beloved of Yah, will survive is to return to their namesake, to embrace Yahweh and Dod. And Yehud is a blend of a compound, if you will, of Yahweh's name and Dod's name, means beloved of Yah. In the midst of this future narrative regarding the demise of Syria, which has already happened, the fall of the government out of Damascus, and then of an uprising of Islamic jihadists in Jordan and Lebanon. The prophecy reveals that the promised land will be narrowed at its midsection. And that's why I'm sharing this prophecy with you now. That is to say, the Islamic jihadists who perpetrated the sadistic massacre and abduction of Jews on October 7th, 2023, will be rewarded with a state of Islamic terrorism. This is the gateway back to the Holocaust. It is Neville Chamberlain Part 2, but far worse. The Nazis, who were exceedingly similar to the Muslims, hadn't attacked when the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain gave them the high ground of Czechoslovakia for the worthless promises of peace. Well, the Muslims have consistently abrogated such agreements, and they have attacked viciously with deadly intent. The impetus to do so will serve as proof positive that progressives are as ignorant, irrational, and immoral as are the Muslims for whom they pimp. Desperate to satiate their cravings for the black ooze upon which their economies are fueled and to appease the Islamic despots and dictators in control of the world's oil spigots, Western progressives will isolate Israel to the point of accommodation and capitulation, and it's going to happen very soon, even when it is advocating on behalf of the devil. The price is going to be the heart of Israel served up on a platter. The United States and Europe will, with worthless words, promises that Israel will remain secure and independent, while they know that's simply hot air. And since it will take the better part of a year to fill the Islamic State to the brim with jihadists and their weapons, the peace will hold for about that long, about the same time that Neville Chamberlain's peace in our time lasted. However, Muslims have never wanted two states. The Gazans don't want two states. The Muslims under the control of the PA, they don't want two states either. All they want is a state of Palestine that's carved out of the heart of Israel that they can use to more readily perpetrate genocide against Jews. So two states is not a solution. It's just an appetizer. Going all the way back to the first year of the Islamic era, to the Pledge of Aqaba demarcating it, Islam has existed to wage war against all mankind until there is just one state remaining: death. Proving their point, Muhammad was the first Muslims to perpetrate genocide against Jews. Of course, even if one is blind to history, the fact remains that Judea and Samaria are not Europe's or America's to give to the terrorists, to the misogynists, to the mass murderers. Yahweh gave this land to the children of Israel. It has been their homeland for 3,000 years. It has been the Jewish homeland and with the capital in Jerusalem for longer than any of the countries in Europe have even existed. Longer than any country in the Americas has existed. According to Yoel and Yeshayah, the sheer number of Islamic terrorists willing to die for their despicable God and deadly cause will be no match for Israel's defense forces. The result will be that at least 100 times worse than the resulting carnage that Israel endured on October 7th. And I think it'll be closer to 1,000 times worse in terms of the numbers of perpetrators and the savagery, even the casualties. Out of necessity, the IDF will eliminate thousands, even millions, as crazed jihadists attempt to cross the border, but it will not be nearly enough, and they will be late as they were the last time. And it will cause, as we have learned, the abduction, torture, rape, plundering, mutilation of Jews by those screaming Allahu Akbar, confessing to their crime. It's just astonishing that the world can play, Israel can play the GoPro films that the Muslims took as they stormed into Israel. And they can realize and hear that every one of these Muslims is constantly screaming Allahu Akbar. They rape and scream Allahu Akbar. They kill babies and scream Allahu Akbar. They take hose and cut off the heads of Jews screaming Allahu Akbar. They throw grenades into a bunker filled with unarmed Jews screaming Allahu Akbar. And yet they want to ascribe the violence to Hamas. I didn't ever hear anyone say, go Hamas. They want to ascribe the violence to Palestinians. There was no Palestine Akbar. Do you think there is an Allah any place other than the Quran and in Islam? If Allahu Akbar being screamed by the murderers, the rapists, the terrorists isn't sufficient to identify the culprits by way of confession, then the audience is brain dead. And yet, Israel, from its prime minister and the IDF, all the way down, and its newspapers, claims that they're fighting against Hamas. They're going to wipe out Hamas. 10/7 wasn't a function of Hamas. It was a result of Islam. Hamas is Islamic. Gaza is Islamic. Screaming Allahu Akbar is Islamic. Killing Jews is Islamic. Justifying rape as a religious act is Islamic. Enslaving Jews in particular is Islamic. It's been part of the Islamic religion since its inception. It's all Quranic. You just have to be totally ignorant or completely irrational, devoid of morality, not to see it as such. And the fact is that when you don't know who your enemy is and you don't prepare for the next assault, but instead from a war that was the last one that you won, you're rendered inept. That's why the IDF was completely unable to respond to the 10/7 attack in Israel. The first wave was at 6 o'clock in the morning. Second wave was at 12. The third wave was at 4 in the afternoon. About the same number of Islamic jihadists coming into Israel during each period, with them over the period of 10 to 12 hours continuing to flood into Israel and to bring hostages back. And in that time, the IDF did not respond. It's repulsive. It's inexcusable. It's a paralyzed country. It's a paralyzed military. It doesn't know how to deal in these kinds of situations. And even in Gaza now, it's great at blowing up buildings from the sky, but you're manufacturing more terrorists than you're killing, and you're turning the world against you. Yes, I would agree that the IDF is the most moral army in the world. I admire the citizen soldiers of the IDF. It's the only military in the world that I would endorse. But that's at the rank and file level, not at the senior officer level. They failed Israel, all of them. And they're no better prepared now to deal with what is to come than they were previous to this. And it's time for Israel to recognize it, that the IDF cannot protect them from the next 10/7. And the next 10/7, 23, is going to occur in June of 2027, a year after the imposition of the two-state dissolution, of the final solution from the Islamic point of view of the Jewish and Israeli problem. The IDF is enormously capable, given time to prep and to drop bombs from airplanes, but they do not perform well. When taken by surprise, are dealing with an enemy and they're entering on foot and motor scooters that are intent on torture, abduction, and rape. Of course, while attempting to curtail their armed attackers from infiltrating their country and perpetrating their murderous ambitions, and it's going to be justifiable as they try to do so again, or that they're currently doing so with their acts within Gaza, although now Netanyahu says we're going to occupy all of Gaza. The cost of lives would be egregious, and ultimately the world would so isolate Israel in the process that Israel couldn't survive. And it wouldn't do any good, because the ultimate goal, which is to defeat Hamas, is not possible, because Hamas is Islam and all of Gaza is Islamic. Now, I'm not just saying that what Israel is doing is wrong. I have laid out a 5-point plan that would have prevailed, and I didn't do it belatedly. I did it on the morning of 10/7/23. And I predicted that Israel would galvanize the world against them while manufacturing more jihadists than they killed. Unfortunately, what Israel has done is being perceived as illegal occupation, as perpetrating genocide by a colonial regime, when exactly, of course, the opposite is true. Muslims have been genocidal and colonial in their apartheid and suppression of the world since Muhammad invented Islam 1400 years ago. In the first 100 years of the Islamic era, Muslims murdered, raped, plundered, subjugated, and enslaved well over 200 million people, 1/3 of the Earth's population. Islam hasn't changed. It will never change. That is what Islam does. And yet it is progressives pimping for Muslims that are blaming Jews as the victims for perpetrating what was done to them. We live in a world of mental midgets without a functioning conscience. The perceived solution, one which is currently being brokered by America, will be to establish a Palestinian state and thereby a terrorist state named after the people who do not actually exist, after a myth that was conceived to perpetrate genocide on God's people, with Fakistan encompassing the Judea and Samaria and what's called the West Bank and Gaza, and bordering Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. This is devastating. And it's going to divide the promised land, narrowing it at its midsection where 70% of the Israeli population currently reside. And by attempting to placate Muslims and prevent an escalation of the war that Muslims began 1400 years ago, the world will ignite in a war to end all wars. Poorly played. America, progressives, Muslims, you're destroying the planet. Now, this prophecy thereby presents the land for peace concessions in which Gaza has been given and the West Bank will be given to the Muslims in exchange for useless proclamations of peace. Israel will be dissected, becoming less than 10 miles across at her midsection. Since Gaza is already gone and the horrific consequence of 10/7/23 is known to us, this will be occurring in stages. It is reasonable to assume that the final act will conclude with a treaty that was described by Gabriel, God's most competent and courageous man, also known as Dode, when he spoke to Daniel, and it's going to usher in the 7-year time of Jacob's troubles. The resulting war is then announced in Yeshaya, Isaiah, and Yirmiah, Jeremiah 30, and throughout the entirety of Joel. And simultaneous with these hostilities, Yahweh will be removing his covenant family on Shabuah, on the Shabat of May 22nd, 2026, which is the commencement of this time of Jacob's troubles. And according to Yeshaya, the time that we are going to witness the imposition of this dagger right in the heart of Israel with a Palestinian state. Therefore, we are now approaching the fulfillment of this very significant intersection of prophecies in this next statement from Yeshaya. Simultaneously, Yahweh is affirming that Israel's continuous existence, as he does, by the way, also in Jeremiah 30 and throughout Yoel, specifically when addressing the fate of the 11 of the 12 tribes, while Benjamin was originally aligned with Yehuda by making a distinction between the two names. Yahweh is saying that the destruction of Damascus and the greater Syria is not only contrasted to the survival of Yehuda and Yisrael, it may not include much of Benjamin. As the source of both Shaul's ill-fated kingship and the false prophet Paul, its exclusion may be symbolic of ridding the land and earth of the government and the religion. At this time, in an ill-fated attempt to assuage Muslim marauders, world leaders are in the process of blackmailing Israel into disengaging from Gaza and surrendering Judea and Samaria, known as the West Bank, to these Islamic terrorists. Affirming this, Yahweh, through his prophet, revealed. And it will actually come to pass. It will occur and exist, happen in a moment of time as a result of men's choices, called perfect, consecutive. In that day, around this time, that the size of Jacob, that the magnitude, dimensions, and volume, that the respect and dignity, that the reputation and abundance, the presence and the power, the honor and the status of Jacob, which is a synonym for Israel, meaning my stance, Jacob, reward or consequence, Abraham's grandson and heir to the covenant, the father of the 12 tribes and the symbolic of a united and reunited Yisrael, from Akkad to receive the benefit or suffer the consequence of circumventing and overreaching, will be decreased to the point of no longer being sustainable, or viable. Will be decreased to the point of no longer being sustainable or viable. The all shall be diminished, making the state incapable of surviving, being thinned and impoverished so that normal life becomes impossible to support, will be weakened, lacking what is essential, from Dalah to devise a plan which stirs up troubling impoverishment. The fattest, best protected, and most important place, the waist or midsection, the most stout and populated area, the most prosperous tract of land, akin to Mashma, to horrify and to devastate. Of his physical existence, Israel's physical existence, Bashar, physical being, to herald this news, will be leaned, razah, made thin, and shrink in size, will be sacrificed to the cause of pagan gods, becoming untenable and unsustainable, from Raz, to hide the ultimate agenda of Rasum, of diseased dignitaries and sick government officials. Yashaya, salvation is from Yahweh. Isaiah 17:4. Let me read that again to you without quite as much amplification so that you clearly understand what the prophet said. After the fall of the government in Damascus, which has now occurred, and this uprising of Islamic terrorists around Israel, particularly the ones who refer to themselves as outcasts, which would be today's Palestinians. Yahweh, through his prophet Yeshayah, reveals. And then it will actually come to pass that in that day, the size, the magnitude, dimensions, and volume of Israel, of Jacob, will be decreased to the point of no longer being sustainable or viable, will be diminished. The fattest, best protected, and most important place, the waist or midsection of his physical existence, will be leaned, made thin, and shrink in size. That is a description of what is called the two-state solution that is about to be imposed on Israel. As a result of this implementation of what is more accurately called the final solution, Israel's going to be rendered indefensible. Malcontent Muslims and fellow Islamic jihadists, armed with flying pipe bombs and incendiary party balloons, while as dumb as the stones they are throwing and as toxic as their Molotov cocktails. 1 billion buffoons are too many for 7 million Jews, especially with 40% of Jews too religious or too political to care. By saying in that day, Yahweh has affirmed that the divestiture of Israeli land is somehow connected to the fall of the Syrian regime, which is something we have already witnessed. And we've even seen the President of the United States embrace the man responsible for overthrowing the Syrian government, calling him attractive, a fighter, a strong, strong man. And although that was what America has sought, while the Bashar al-Assad regime was ruthless, the jihadists who have now replaced him and have come to rule Syria as an Islamic government as opposed to a secular dictator, they are far worse, not only for Syrians, but also for Israel. It is why it is so counterproductive for the United States to be arming and supporting jihadists. But something the United States can't keep from doing. And it should be noted that the Islamic State is a product of United States miscalculation. General Petraeus came up with the lame idea that there was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Never existed. But he knew that there was a serious problem of the fact that the non-Al-Qaeda types, the Shia Muslims, were killing Americans, and they were in the most ruthless militias. So his schemed idea was that he would arm Sunni Muslims, which would be affiliated with Al-Qaeda, but outside of Iraq, since Saddam Hussein hated Al-Qaeda, they didn't exist in Iraq. George Bush therefore lied when he said they did. So Petraeus decided, I'm going to arm the Sunni Muslims so that they can battle the Shia Muslims and thereby create some kind of neutrality by them killing each other, and that will make Iran a Iraq a safer place for the U.S. to operate. And so he gave copious amounts of weapons and what's called the Awakening Program to these Sunni Muslims. Well, the Awakening Program became the Islamic State. And they went directly to places like Mosul, and they took Yazidi women and turned them into sex slaves. They crucified Yazidi men. They ransacked Iraq and Syria, becoming the most ruthless expression of Islam the world had yet seen. And al-Julani was the leader of the Islamic State. So it's important that we keep apprised of how this mess came to be. So the United States is complicit in starting this proxy war through the invasion of Iraq, whereby the nation was placed under the control of Iranian religious regime. When Petraeus couldn't count either, and so nor could George Bush. George Bush I knew personally. I knew that he couldn't count past, well, the number of fingers and toes. Not realizing that 70% of Iraqis were Shia Muslims, and that in Islam, the Muslim does as the Imam tells them, because in Islam, the Quran says you have no choice. You do as your Imam tells you to do. Therefore, when they had a vote, they voted for the Shia Ayatollah types in Iraq that were beholden to the Ayatollah in Iran. And so all they did is give Iraq to Iran. That's what our invasion of Iraq did. It created the Islamic State, and it gave Iraq to Iran. Talk about stupid at the cost of thousands of American lives. It was among the dumbest things that the United States has ever done. And we created the mess that the prophet has spoken of, that's poised to destroy Israel at a time that, rather than apologizing for what the United States did, rather than protecting Israel from American malfeasance, nope, America is now weaponizing and siding with the Muslims that it has empowered and enriched against Israel. It's an incredibly sad story. So contemporaneously, America capitulated on the Iranian nuclear program, freeing Iran's assets while reestablishing her ability to sell sufficient amounts of oil and gas to assure that the threat of a nuclear bomb was imminent. As a matter of fact, when Trump canceled the broken agreement that Iran had violated in every possible way, because, of course, the Iranian government is run by Muslims. They don't honor agreements. It's part of Islam. And they continued to pursue their nuclear bomb plan that America decided, well, we'll sanction them again. And we sanctioned them. It was Qatar that laundered their oil so they could complete their nuclear bomb program. But then Trump went and embraces Qatar as our great ally when it is the one working behind our back to facilitate the Iranian program. And then after Iran already has all of their weapon-grade uranium enriched, Trump decides, well, we'll have negotiations with them. We'll have coffee breaks every other week and have little chit-chats and see what we can do, with zero chance of success, but all the while telling Israel that they can't protect themselves by taking out those nuclear facilities. It is one of the great betrayals in all of human history that we're witnessing right now, that Trump is doing for a very large bribe. He was bribed $16.5 billion to side with the Muslims against Israel. And that's just one huge immoral miscalculation after another, all leading to the betrayal and sacrifice of Israel and Israeli territory. And it's going to be again promoted as peaceful and as doing the moral and right thing and being fair and having two peoples peacefully live side by side. It's just such rot, and it's so obviously untrue. And yet these immoral bastions of anti-Semitism are going to perpetrate it nonetheless. And what we're going to see is an event that is going to trigger World War III worldwide, which is going to be nuclear. All the while, millions of Jews will die at the hands of enraged jihadists who are not only going to come from the outside of Israel, but now from the inside as well. The promised land is going to be inundated with terrorists. This prophecy specifically states that the size of Jacob, Israel, serving as a synonym for the current nation, inclusive of Jacob's descendants, the land that they were given and the covenant relationship that they were offered, are going to be decreased in magnitude and dimension such that it is unsustainable, making the tiny nation imminently and indefensibly vulnerable. It portends that this reduction will be wholly incompatible with Israel's continued existence. A Palestinian state is the gateway to the next Holocaust. And it will occur at the nation's midsection, at its waist, as is foretold, and make the nation vulnerable. And when we combine this prophecy with those delineated by Gabriel and Joel, we know that this will occur 7 years prior to the Messiah and King's return, at the outset of the time of Jacob's troubles, which is in May of 2026, at the insistence of world leaders in cahoots with the recently arrived Torahless one, but that the leader who is the most responsible for undermining Israel is the United States. While there will be no Armageddon, no Antichrist, no Magog Federation, the alignment of progressives, communists, fascists, and Muslims with Hasatan against Israel will be devastating. According to the prophet Joel, this will be the single worst time and experience in all of human history. Worse than World War II, worse than the Holocaust. Everywhere among the prophets, we read that this divestiture of land will be at the behest of diseased dignitaries and government officials, which with a hidden agenda. But the result is known. Israel will shrink in size, and the country's midsection will be sacrificed to those worshiping and killing for Hasatan. This will occur following the destruction of the Damascus government, its downfall, and be so devastating to Israel's ability to defend itself from an onslaught of terrorists. We'll soon discover that God himself will have to intervene to save his people. And only then, when enough of them return to him, that he can return to them, which is why we do these programs. Although he will not do so until Yom Kippurim, although he will protect many on Shabuah and on Towrah prior to that time, for those who return to him, there will be a safe haven. And ultimately, it will be on the second day of Towrah, on the Shabat of September 24th and 2033, that the final remnant of Yisrael will be spared and Israel's enemies will be wiped out. Israel does, at least a remnant of Israel does prevail in the end, as does our planet, but not before suffering unimaginable casualties. This is a vivid portrayal of the utterly moronic and recent land for peace and two-state solution. This diplomatic proposition among immoral and irrational progressives has the world forcing Israel to give complete control of Gaza and the West Bank over to the Muslims who announced an overt, unchanging, and core religious, political, and military agenda is to annihilate Jews and obliterate Israel. Giving more land, a commodity Muslims already have vastly more than they need, to a religious community that has never upheld a peace treaty and was born to kill, may be among the dumbest, most immoral, and irrational notions ever perpetrated by world leaders. And yet, the very fact that this irrational and immoral trade is inevitable and going to be discussed in 2 weeks between the 2nd and 4th of June in New York City in conjunction with the United Nations tells you just how depraved humanity has become. It is going to be almost universally upheld that Israel must die, that Israel must be sacrificed to the most demonic religion ever conceived, and at the insistence of Islam's progressive pimps. It saddens me that as I share these words with you last night, a beautiful Jewish couple was savagely gunned down and murdered by a progressive pimp of Islam calling for a free Palestine in Washington, D.C., as they visited an event at a museum. And even as this scum of the earth, progressive, was hauled away by law enforcement, he continued to shout, "Free Palestine." It is the very conveyance of this word by Jews themselves, by the government of Israel, by the IDF, by the United Nations, by the United States, by Europeans, that is the bane of human existence. Palestine is not a nation. It's a call to terrorize Jews. Its purpose is genocide. Palestine was conceived to legitimize the mass murder of Jews. And yet, it is under this sinister hoax that the United States and Europe and Muslim nations will partner to take Israelis back to the Holocaust. This fulfillment of this revelation was so improbable at the time it was inspired. So let's just take a step back in history to gain a perspective on the profound implications inherent in this foretelling of what is now imminent and inevitable. Apart from a being who exists beyond our dimensions, who is akin to light and has the ability to witness the entire fabric of time at one time, one who has a keen interest in our well-being and a desire for us to know him, the aforementioned events would have been impossible to accurately predict and convey through the prophet Yeshaya Isaiah, circa 700 BCE. For these events to occur as they were predicted 2,700 years ago, an already thrice conquered Israel would have to become reestablished and then made whole. And yet, just as predicted, after 1,900 years of exile And against all odds, the Israelites have returned home to become a sovereign nation again, rising out of the ashes of the European death camps of Zyklon B showers and crematoria. This incomparable miracle occurred in stages. Israel was last unified under David and his son Solomon from around 1000 to 900 BCE. After surviving 400 years estranged and 8 decades as slaves in Egypt, being menaced and plundered by surrounding tribes, such as the Moabites and Amalekites, the land was viciously conquered and it was torn to pieces by the Assyrians and then the Babylonians, with the Israelites hauled off to slavery both times. A remnant returned only to be conquered and controlled by the Macedonian Greeks. Two of the most vicious conquests in world history followed, both perpetrated by Imperial Rome, the most vicious civilization man has ever known. The first in 70 CE and then again in 133. Yehudim became virtually extinct in the land, with only a tiny remnant remaining as slaves within the Roman Empire. Thereafter, the Byzantines claimed control of the land under Roman Catholicism, the beast that would tread upon the whole world. Their subjugation was followed in succession by Shiite and then Sunni Muslims, the Turkish Ottoman Empire, and then prior to, during, and immediately after the Holocaust, the British lorded over Israel on behalf of the counterproductive and anti-Semitic Muslims. All the while, the land remained essentially desolate and decimated, exceedingly inhospitable to the people to whom it had been given. Then in 1948, in a sigh of collective grief, the United Nations, the organization most hostile to Israel today, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, awarded a tiny portion of the promised land to Israelites who had survived the collective European and Christian assault on them during the Holocaust. And that same year, facing Islamic kingdoms established in the aftermath of World War I, which outnumbered them 1,000 to 1, each of which was wielding vastly superior weapons. God's people, fighting as civilians without so much as even a common language, won their war of independence against their combined foes of the Muslim world. Well, we would be hard-pressed to find another ethnicity that survived 400 years as refugees and then captives in a foreign land. The wholesale destruction of their nation by Assyrians and Babylonians and then Romans, or an event akin to the Holocaust. This victory and their war of independence is arguably the most inexplicable. And yet, even then, the whole of the Gaza Strip and the entire West Bank remained part of Egypt and Jordan, respectively, thereby still precluding the thinning of a united Israel as the prophecy portends. It was not until the fledgling nation prevailed against a second unified Islamic assault in 1967 during the Six-Day War that Israel reclaimed much of Yahweh's original gift. And against all odds, they miraculously retained it in the aftermath of the surprise attack by Islamic forces on Yom Kippurim in October of 1973, just 6 years thereafter. But there's so much more to this prophecy. because it would be another 44 years before America's invasion of Iraq would lead to the Syrian war, ultimately leading to the destruction of Damascus and the catalyst for the overthrow that we have just witnessed of the Syrian government. And then it was Israel's response to the devastating murder, rape, plunder, torture of its people on 10/7 by trying to stop the Muslims in Gaza from doing it again, that has galvanized the world against Israel. And ultimately, we have Muslims in Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the United Arab Emirates providing $16 billion of bribes to Donald Trump, who will be the next Neville Chamberlain, who is now poised to betray Israel, just as Europe, in one country after another, declares the imposition of a fake Palestinian state. How all of these pieces could miraculously fall into place, it's inconceivable, and yet here we are. The impossible has become the inevitable. It's all happened before our eyes. It's now literally inevitable. It will materialize over the next 12 months. Now, what makes this prophecy extraordinary is that it was committed to writing just shy of 3 millennia ago, in the waning days of the 8th century BCE, somewhere between 740 and 730 BCE, when Israel was being ripped to shreds, its cities razed, its people enslaved. Moreover, we possess ancient verifications of these predictions. The great Isaiah scroll dates past 200 BCE and is the oldest surviving complete copy of any book written in antiquity. What are the odds that all of this would occur? And let's not forget, Yashayah is a textbook on what I am doing for you on tutoring, announcing that I'd be the one who would be inspired to communicate all of this to you in advance of it occurring. So for the first time, you would understand what the prophet said. For any of this to matter, Yahweh would have to find and equip his Malach messenger to explain this prophecy so that the children of Israel could benefit from it before it is too late. And then listen to his choder, his Nakri, thereafter, as he guides them home. Because he got it right. Obviously, conditions that would have been inconceivable at the time they were being foretold are now a reality. Ephraim, representing the northern kingdom at the time of this writing, was separated from Yehudah, and that means that there was no Israel to thin it the ways. The northern kingdom itself was under siege, being attacked by the world's most ruthless superpower, the Assyrians. Huge swaths of the nation were falling under the control of the Assyrian monarchs. Tiglath-Pileser the third and Salmaneser the fifth, Sargon the second, and his successor, Sennacherib, following in their father's footsteps. And they took 20 years to systematically ransack most of what David and his son Solomon had built 200 years earlier. Recognizing that the improbability and precision of this prophecy prove that Yahweh's statements can be trusted and that he exists, that his inspiration for Yahowah through Yahowah should be trusted. It is relevant to know that after the death of Solomon and Shalomo, in 931 BCE, every tribe except Yehuda and Benjamin refused to accept Rehoboam, the son and successor of Solomon, as their king. This rift was principally economic, as he refused to lower the onerous tax imposed by his licentious father. These 10 tribes preferred Jeroboam, who was residing in Egypt at the time. Upon his return in 920 CE, they pronounced him king in Shechem, leaving Yehuda completely isolated and Israel divided. These choices set the stage for traumatic events transpiring as Yahowah transcribed Yahweh's foretelling of future world events. By 740 BCE, Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser began to systematically brutalize and enslave the remnants of Israel. His conquest and subjugation were so complete that 10 of Jacob's 12 tribes were considered lost. Reuben and Gad were the first to succumb, then Messiah. They were marched into Syria with chains through their noses, and they would remain captives for centuries. Then in 722 BCE, the surviving capitals of the northern kingdom were ransacked, Shechem and Tirzah, along with most of Samaria under King Omri. During the siege, Salmanaser V died and was succeeded by Sargon II. He would brag, "Samaria I looked at. I captured 27,280 men who dwelt in it, and I carried them and the proceeds away into Assyria. Duly recorded on an ancient stele by the victors, this appeared to be the final curtain for the kingdom of Israel, especially for Ephraim. It had been wiped off the face of the earth. The likelihood that this prophecy would be fulfilled was nil. If we were to have read it then, we would have had declared it a farce. The oldest extant collaborations of this period, besides the testimony found in Chronicles and Kings, include the aforementioned Assyrian stele inscription discovered in ancient Assyria, in addition to the intriguing stele found in Jordan, the Mishnah stele housed in the Louvre, which is a 3-foot tall, smooth black basalt stone. It contains the longest Iron Age inscription ever found, and it was written using the Hebrew alphabet in the Moabite dialect of the language in the 9th century BCE. The history depicted on the inscription parallels the account detailed in the Book of Kings. It refers to the kingdom of Israel as distinct from the kingdom of Yehuda. It addresses the house of Omri and the house of David, and it speaks of their God, Yahweh. These historical collaborations are important because they affirm that Yahweh's eyewitness portrayal of human events, whether past, present, or now future, are universally, precisely, and consistently accurate. After all, from God's perspective, prophecy isn't just about predicting the future. It is the result of Him seeing the whole fabric of the human experience and then reporting what He has witnessed in our future, in our past, and having His prophets write it down. So when things like this very specific prophecy about the fall of the government in Damascus and the outcasts in Jordan amassing as terrorists, and this leading to the imposition of a treaty that severs Israel, thinning the nation at its waist so it's no longer defensible. And of all of this occurring, it's astonishing. It not only proves that the prophecy was inspired by God and can be trusted, but that Yahweh exists. And it tells us exactly what we should expect. God communicates our future and our past long before these events transpire, so that we know we can trust him. And as Yahweh's testimony corroborates, the kingdom of Yahudah survived the initial Assyrian assault. This occurred in part because the tiny nation capitulated and became a vassal state. But some 20 years later, Hezekiah, king of Yahudah, sought to end his nation's subservience to the Mesopotamian warlords, and he ceased paying the tribute imposed by Assyria and forged an alliance with Mitzrayim, with Egypt. However, the Egyptians proved equally unreliable, and in the fourth year of Sennacherib's reign in 701 BCE, Yehudim became isolated, became defenseless, and capitalizing upon the tiny nation's vulnerability, 185,000 Assyrians, military trained soldiers, began marching in their direction with the express intent of plundering what little was left of the kingdom of Dod. Without divine intervention, the story of Yahudah would have been over at that moment, along with any memory of Yisrael. As it would transpire, what happened next serves as a lesson for Jews today. Hopelessly outnumbered and outarmed, Hezekiah initially tried to pay off Sennacherib with 300 talents of silver and 30 of gold. But after the payment was made, the Assyrian king simply renewed his assault and laid siege on Jerusalem. And before and after his misguided faith in military alliances and money and potentates proved unreliable, the king tried the opposite approach and came to rely upon the Torah and its author, Yahweh. He destroyed every religious site in Yahudah, and he began to prepare his people for so that they could celebrate Passover, unyeasted bread, and firstborn children in accordance with Yahweh's instructions. If only Moshe Dayan, who gave the Temple Mount his soldiers captured during the Six-Day War back to the Muslim usurpers. If he had followed Hezekiah's example, the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque would have been razed rather than continue to inspire Islamic terror. Hezekiah's approach, his reliance on Yahweh and the Mikra, and his willingness to observe the Torah and act upon its guidance were sufficient. By obliterating all traces of religion and relying upon God, Yahweh did the rest, sending a Malach messenger out to poison the Assyrian army as they prepared for their final assault outside the city gates. Now, there were not 4,000 to 6,000 Islamic jihadists carrying hoes and picks and knives. These were 185,000 of the best soldiers on the planet, and they weren't even allowed to fire a shot. Yehudah would not exist today had that not been the case. Sennacherib had thought that as the favorite son of the gods, as the leader of the world's most powerful military, the city would be easy prey. Just the day before his troops were annihilated, he is recorded telling Yehudim that in the manner of their king, that they had destroyed all manner of religion, they too would be destroyed. Yeah, so he actually touted them. He said, I know your king got rid of all of the religious traces, shrines, and idols in Yehuda. Just as he destroyed them, I will destroy you. And yet, as we now know, the assemblage of false gods and human military might was no match for a single Malach of Yahowah. The same is true when pitting collective efforts of progressive Muslims and Orthodox Christians against the Malach messenger of Yahowah today. Well, a century later, Yehudim became prosperous and self-reliant, forsaking their relationship with Yahowah and his Torah. It was a poor choice and worse timing because the surrounding civilians were in upheaval and vying for power. The Babylonians overran the Assyrian capital in Nineveh in 612 BCE, prompting Israel's vicious foe to relocate to Haran, which was even closer to Yehuda. But by 610 BCE, it too was captured by the Babylonians. As a result, the Assyrian king Ashur-uballit II moved to Chakmarish of the Euphrates, and he waited for the Egyptian army to rescue him. But Pharaoh Necho II was delayed at Megiddo, northwest of Jerusalem, by the forces of King Josiah of Judea. And while Josiah was killed and his army was defeated, because the Pharaoh's army arrived later than expected, the combined Egyptian and Assyrian forces failed in their siege of the Babylonian army garrisoned in Haran. So they retreated to northern Syria, where in 605 BCE, the remaining Assyrians and Egyptians met the full strength of Babylonian military might led by Nebuchadnezzar. Israel's two most ardent foes were defeated, ending the Assyrian run as an independent nation while dramatically diminishing Egypt's influence. As a result, for Yahowah's prophecy to be valid, Assyria would have to be reformed as a political entity and a nation state, something that would not occur until the 20th century. Immediately after defeating Egypt and Assyria, Nebuchadnezzar invaded Judah, hoping to avoid annihilation. Of course, Yehuda's king, Jeroboam, Jeroboam, changed allegiances from the recently defeated Egypt and to Babylonian, and he paid an ungodly tribute, which included the temple's artifacts and members of the royal family who were taken hostages. However, 4 years later, in 601 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar returned, and this time was rebuffed in his attempt to invade Egypt, suffering heavy losses. Trying to capitalize on the swing of political and military fortunes, Yehuda's king, Jeroboam, withheld his Babylonian tribute and allied once again with Egypt. And as a result, Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem, the capital of Yehuda, in 597 BCE. Following Jehoiakim's ultimate untimely death, the Babylonian monarch pillaged the city and the temple. He took the nation's new king, the 18-year-old Jeconiah, prisoner, along with the preponderance of the population, including the king's court, prominent citizens, those who were literate, and all craftsmen, leaving only a smattering of the most impoverished Yehudim in the land. But unlike anything that had happened previously, a remnant would eventually return, reconstituting Yehuda, Judah, but not Ephraim, the northern kingdom, or Israel. Then, as their appreciation of Yahowah faded again, they would be conquered and subjugated by the Greeks. It was a particularly nasty episode among a Jewish civil war that began between religious factions, which was ultimately overshadowed by the deplorable conduct of Antiochus Epiphanes, serving as a foretaste for the Torah one of tomorrow. Next came the Romans. The initial invasion in 66 BCE by Pompey was at the behest of Jewish religious rivals. And their second assault on Yahudah, the province of Judah, infighting between Jews, made their demise certain. By 70 CE, the temple was destroyed and Jewish slaves were paraded into Rome, carrying even Yahweh's menorah, and then forced to build the Roman Colosseum as slaves. Yet another conflict between Jewish religious factions served Publius Aurelius Hadrianus as his 3 Roman legions razed the city of Jerusalem, initiated the diaspora, and renamed Yahudah Philistia after the long extant enemy of Israel, a name unknown to the world outside of the Torah, Wanabi. And this was initiated by another act of Jewish malfeasance, religious Jewish malfeasance, and the promotion of a false Messiah, Bar Kokhba. Imperial Rome crucified tens of thousands of Israelites, taking the others into Rome as slaves. In the eyes of the world, especially from the perspective of Imperial Rome and then the Roman Catholic Church, which evolved from it, there was no longer a place known as Israel or Yahudah, and the people who had once called both home were now property to use and to abuse. It was a mindset the Roman Catholic Church would not relinquish, making the restoration of Yahudah and Yisrael ever more improbable. As proof, read Cromwell's Hitler's Pope to see how the immoral and anti-Semitic Archbishop and Cardinal Pacelli, who became Pope Pius XII, not only solidified Hitler's control over Germany, but also facilitated the final solution. Over the centuries, a succession of Christian and Muslim powers would lay claim over a land so ransacked that it could barely support nomads. Then half of the surviving Yehudim population still living there in the lands once controlled by Rome were massacred in human death camps during the Holocaust. It was against this backdrop of human events that makes Yahweh's declaration so enormously improbable, so as to be considered rationally impossible. And yet, we are now witnessing its fulfillment. But that's not the end of this story. Somewhat recently, the United States, under the Bush administration, compelled Israel to relinquish Gaza, surrendering it to Muslims who were trying to exterminate them. The result was to turn a buffer zone into a breeding ground for jihadists and to a staging area for rocket launchers. The blood of 1,200 Jewish lives now stains George Bush's soul, as the Muslims he sought to appease left the place he had given them and entered Israel to take the rest of the land through terrorism. Having spent considerable time with this horrible man on a number of occasions, I can attest that he really was that immoral, that self-absorbed, and that stupid. Fortunately, he and his daddy will spend eternity in Sheol for their crimes against God's people. But not to be outdone, in the race to anti-Semite hell, the Obama administration began coercing Israel into abandoning the West Bank and the Golan Heights to impose the two-state solution. His so-called roadmap to peace is the same plan the Iraq Study Group proposed to resolve the Sunni uprising against Shia overlords that America had empowered after deposing Saddam Hussein in Iraq. But Obama actually went so far as to unite Europe against Israel in order to blackmail the nation into either capitulating or being cut off from the rest of the world. The fulfillment of this prophecy has, therefore, been in the works for some time. Part of the plan would, with world leaders have concocted against Yahowah's chosen people, has continued to play out as a special accommodation. I'll support them taking Dick Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, Karl Rove with the Bushes for moral support in hell. All the while, under the Biden administration, the United States gave Iran a free hand and boatloads of money to complete their nuclear ambitions. Further, Saudi Arabia has used the petrodollar to force America's hand into arming it to the hilt while sacrificing Israel's viability with the imposition of an Islamic State. And now they control the President of the United States, having bought him. In context, it is telling that the United States sacrificed the lives of thousands of American soldiers to protect Saudi Arabian Muslims, while America has never fought to protect Israel. Apparently, it is patriotic and heroic for Americans to bleed and die, saving Saudis from fellow Muslims, but not to protect Jews in the same way. When implemented, the two-state dissolution that Donald Trump is going to be the architect of and claim credit for his prize, and to pay back Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates for their $16.5 billion gift. It's going to thin Israel at the waist to an indefensible width. Since 70% of Israel's wealth and population reside in this region, the nation will become especially vulnerable because the terrorists will empower this concession and capitalize upon it. Muslims will terrorize Israel as never before, far worse than what was witnessed on October 7th, 2023, the same week that I was editing what I'm sharing with you now. And as a result of the concessions Israel will make, mostly at the insistence of the United States, Europe, and the United Nations and Muslim scum, Jews will soon be overwhelmed by a flood of Islamic terrorists. Rather than 1,500 to 2,000 in each of the three phases that invaded Israel 2 years ago, Jews will soon be overwhelmed by a flood of Islamic terrorists. It could be between 500 and 1,000 times worse than what was previously experienced. And this time they won't all come from one place outside of Israel. They're going to come from all around Israel and from inside out. With Iran's participation and Qatari support of Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, Hamas, and its occupation of Iraq and control of Syria for that time, and with the inclusion of Egypt, African Muslims, Jordanians, and Turkey, will lead the great jihad. There will be between 100 and 1,000 times the number of Muslims being Muslims in their pursuit of Jews. There won't be 2,000 rockets and 20 power gliders. Israel should expect 200,000 rockets, 2,000 drones, and many missiles. Islamic terrorists surrounding Israel will deploy the same strategy of overwhelming the Iron Dome with more rockets than it can manage, thereby turning cities into raging infernos. At the same time, they will overwhelm smaller and more vulnerable communities with an onslaught of jihadists. They will invade with sufficient numbers and force of arms to hold entire communities hostage, leaving Israel with the impossible choice between capitulation and complete annihilation. And as many have feared, this conflagration of religious hatred will spread and engulf the world. Initially, billions, many of whom will be Muslims, will die in the Middle Eastern countries thereafter. But then this regional religious conflict will turn into a world war. And the debacle begun by Iran's belligerence and Qatari funding and Trump's missteps, aided by American complicity and weapons, it's going to go nuclear. And billions more will succumb before the bombs stop falling. It will make America's concession to Islamic terrorism the single deadliest and most destructive blunder in human history. The beginning of the end was Donald Trump's last ride into the Middle East. This is a miscalculation, almost infinitely worse than invading Afghanistan and Iraq to depose their rulers. And should someone think that I'm making too big a deal of America's malfeasance in the demise of Israel, just wait till you hear the rebuke of the United States of America in Yeshaya 18. Well, I want to thank you for listening. I've gone longer than I intended in this episode of the YAHOWAH blog on the gateway to Israel's next Holocaust. But this is important for you to know. I want you to know what the prophet said, why we know we can trust what the prophet said, and why all of the things that have happened in the world have led up to this event, and why it is now inevitable. And I want Israel prepared for it, but I also want Jews, once it transpires, to know that they can trust the one that Yahweh has inspired to tell them their future. Thank you for listening.